So for this video, we're going to be talking about properties of cosine functions in 6 and in 7 for the IXL for my class. We talked about sine functions most recently before going on this break that we're on now, so this would be our next step to help us progress forward. We'll talk through a couple of the IXL problems for what it gives me for each of the two, and hopefully that helps you guys when you're working through it. For this one, it's going to ask for a specific piece of the given function, and it shows us, I believe, the picture first, and then later on it will give us the function. This is specifically finding properties of the cosine functions. If we were in class, I might say by the end of class you need to be able to graph a cosine function, so this is like the building block for it. Because we're doing screen capture right now, I'm going to be using some of these writing tools to write on the screen. Bear with me, I'm just using a trackpad right now, so it might get a little sloppy. So let's go ahead and start into it. For amplitude of a function, we're thinking about how far from the middle of the graph. So by the middle, I would mean like this right here where this kind of jagged line is that I'm drawing, to the top of the graph. So like here. And we see that that's 2 units, so my amplitude in this case would be 2. Another way of thinking about it would be to go from the very bottom to the very top, so like -2 to 2. That's 4 units, and then halving that would be 2. Sometimes that's more obvious to some, others prefer this way. This seems a little more simple to me, so that's why I like to explain this first. So my amplitude here would be 2 based off this. So let's go ahead and show that. Oops. There we go. For finding the period of a function, so remember what that means is it's how long it takes before it would start over. So from like this top of this peak till we get to the top of the next peak, because then it would start over. We need to think about basically how far this way. And if I look at that on my quote-unquote x-axis, how far is that? Well, that's 3 pi that it takes us to get to there. So if I go to my period, that would be 3, and then it gives you a pi button to type in. Okay, something else I could ask for is a vertical shift. Something I would ask you to pay attention to for this is the midline, or that middle of the graph. So if we think about the middle being like 3, for example, because it goes up to 7 and down to -1, so 3 would be the middle. Normally the middle is at 0, so now I'm up 3 units. That tells me when I scroll down and put my answer in, it's a +3, and I don't even have to type in like a plus or anything like that, just 3. If I was down here, I would need to put the -3. So that's what I'm looking for. Not necessarily this y-intercept, but the whole graph, the middle moves up and down. Okay, we talked about amplitude. Let's see if there's anything else that's new that we haven't discussed on this one before going to N7. Talked about that. Okay, so it does get into the function. This is actually like the parent graph. That's the base version of the function. When you have the base version or the parent graph, this value, this coefficient would be 1. Inside this would be a 1. It'd be like a +0 tacked on to the end. So nothing really happening here. Amplitude is based off of this coefficient. So what would technically be a 1 right there. That tells me my amplitude is a 1. For vertical shift, now you see there's something tacked on here. Whatever this is going to take that middle of the graph and move it up or down, in this case down because it's negative, and then this many units, so I would put -1 here. I did put that you can stop at 70 for this one, that gets you all the points for this. However, if you want to keep going, this might be more helpful moving forward. Amplitude, now you see how that's changed. So now it would be like a 2. Does it give us anything else? Okay, so this one you might run into phase shift. Phase shift is talking about picking up the whole graph and moving left or right. It deals with this whole part in parentheses there. What you would need to do is take that whole thing, so like the 2x plus 2 pi, and then set it equal to 0. And if we solve that, I would take away 2 pi on each side, so I'd have 2x. That would cancel out. I'd have equals 0 minus 2 pi, well, that'd just be negative 2 pi. Divide by 2 on both sides to get just x. And I'd have x equals negative 2 divided by 2 would be negative 1, or just negative, you don't even have to put the 1, pi. So when I go to type that in, I'd put negative pi, and then that would be my answer. Okay, this is the last one I was going to look for before we move forward. Period, when you're given the function, is based just on this value here. IXL calls it the b value. I think I used k in class. Basically, if you're given a function like this, you're probably going to be in radians. But if you're given a graph, you might need to use degrees instead, just dependent on what the units are on the graph. You're going to have the formula basically either 2 pi divided by b, or instead of 2 pi, it might be 360, like I said, if you're in degrees. This is going to equal your period length. I'll abbreviate here. B is this value right here, so in our case we would have 2 pi divided by 2, well, and then equals our period. And well, these 2's would cancel, leaving just pi as our period. So I would say period length equals pi. That tells me the whole thing would get kind of scrunched together and repeat by the time it gets to pi instead of 2 pi typically. Okay, so that covers, I think, everything that you might see, at least an example of each for N6. N7, find an equation. So you're making this equation this time, so it's kind of like the tail end of the other one. If you understand the tail end of N6, N7 should be doable. This actually starts you with, I believe this is going to be true for everybody, just the base version of cosine, which is what we were just talking about in the previous IXL. Cosine, you see this is an amplitude of 1, the midline's still at 0, the period is 2 pi, so all that's kind of what we would say is like typical. That's our base version of the graph. Here, there's some changes though. I want to look at all these different pieces it gives us. So, this D value here is based on the midline going up or down. It's still at 0, so I'm not going to have any changes there. This is going to be a phase shift. My guess is we're not going to have to deal with that at all in this, but it does technically exist. B is period, what we just talked about. In this case, it takes us, if we're starting at 0, till 2 pi before it repeats. That's our kind of base version, so nothing different about B. But for A, our amplitude is still 1 from the middle to the highest peak. However, it gets flipped over. Now we're down at -1 to start. So when we would write that, we would put -1 or just negative cosine x. So that's our only change. Here we can see like an amplitude of 2, so like that A value would be 2 this time. Let's see what else we have. Oh, let's look at this one. So my midline now is right here at -2. Oops, that's a little iffy. Right there at -2, because half of the graph is above it, half of the graph is below it. My amplitude is from the middle to the top. That's still 1, even though it's 2 blocks. If you look at what we're measuring here, that's still 1. So that tells me my A value is just going to be a 1, or you don't have to put anything there. B, for the period, it takes until 3 pi to repeat. So what that means is I'm going to have to say 2 pi divided by, we said that B value, equals our new period, which is 3 pi. I'll talk us through it, although I don't know if we'll write each thing. If we multiplied both sides by b, this would cancel, and the b would go over here, and then we would divide by the 3 pi. So I'll write that part out. And then I'd have 2 pi divided by 3 pi. And if this doesn't make sense to you, you can always pause, rewind, go back through, ask me questions if you need. We'd have that once we divide by this. The pi's would cancel, leaving just 2 over 3, or 2/3. If you typed it in a calculator, it would give you the same thing. So that tells me my b value, instead of just have 1 here, I'm going to have 2/3 x. And then in terms of a vertical shift, normally that midline is at 0, and we said now it's down at -2, so that tells me I'm going to have a -2 at the end. So just kind of have to break down each individual piece. So I think that kind of gives an example now of everything. You've seen vertical shift, you've seen amplitude, you've seen the period length. Like I said, I don't think we deal with phase shift here. Like, for example, we see the midlines here now. That's going to change the vertical shift. Got to count your amplitude. Got to figure out how long before it repeats. And then set up that 2 pi over b and solve. So I'll let you guys give that a shot. If you run into any questions, I know this is different and everything, feel free to leave comments on here or email me, and hopefully we can make some progress and still push forward during this break. Alright, we'll see you guys.